Hi everyone, and welcome to the National Environmental Science Program Climate Systems Hub webinar, Tracking Progress, Insights from the Australian Adaptation Database. So my name is Heidi Evans, and I'm a knowledge broker with the Climate Systems Hub. As the New South Wales knowledge broker, my role sits in the New South Wales Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water. So that's New South Wales DQ, not the federal one. Today we're sharing with you the output from one of the longer term projects of the Hub, the Australian Adaptation Database. And we're going to cover how the database was built, what it can tell us, and how it can support decision making in the climate adaptation space. And we'll also explore how it's being used to track our adaptation progress as a nation. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of Canada Bay in Sydney, where I'm joining you from today. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and would also like to extend my respects to all First Nations peoples joining us today. The Climate Systems Hub recognises the important role traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. So we know you're dialing in from across Australia. Please take a moment to think about the traditional owners of the lands where you're joining from. So a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our first speaker. The webinar is being recorded and the link will be available on the NESP Climate Systems Hub website afterwards, and it will be emailed out to all participants too. You'll have to bear with me, I'm a bit unwell, I'm just going to cough. Okay, so we encourage you to ask questions. You can do this at any time by typing them into the chat function. So you'll see like a little speech bubble on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where you pop your questions in. We'll address as many questions as possible after all the speakers have presented. However, I encourage you to get in early as we don't always have time to address all the questions. If this is your first Climate Systems Hub webinar, a big welcome to you. These webinars are designed to provide an opportunity for learning and interaction with a broad range of topics and experts. We've had a great range of presentations already this year, and today's is going to be another one. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Tia Brullo. So Tia is a human geographer with research interests in climate change adaptation and monitoring and evaluation. She's currently a research fellow at the University of Melbourne, working with the Climate Systems Hub. Tia's research takes a pragmatic approach to understanding climate change adaptation in Australia and involves working alongside government stakeholders and adaptation practitioners to design tangible knowledge outputs. So over to you, Tia.
Thanks, Heidi, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry, bear with me while I do my slides. So to understand where we stand on climate risks, we don't just need to understand our climate risk data, but we also need to look at how adaptation is addressing those climate risks and what risks remain. And for this reason, adaptation stocktaking is something that governments have been interested in for some time, and it's also been written into the Paris Agreement as part of the global stocktake. So far, though, any analysis of adaptation progress that has been done has been pretty rare and inconsistent and plagued by challenges and disagreement on methodology. Our NESP Climate Systems Hub project began in 2023, and one of the outputs that was agreed was a national adaptation stocktake. And the reason for this was to get a better understanding of how adaptation was progressing in Australia. Our team had observed a growth in adaptation policy and planning, but limited data as to how these plans were being implemented. And so we had a sense that there was some adaptation work that was flying under the radar. It was very good timing for an adaptation stocktake project. Discussions were gearing up for the first global stocktake on adaptation as part of the Paris Agreement, and the first national climate risk assessment was about to kick off, so it quickly gained momentum. Data collection for the project began in July 2023 at the Climate Adaptation Conference in Adelaide. We knew that in order to gain an understanding of the entire adaptation landscape in Australia, we needed input from adaptation experts. So we asked adaptation professionals what examples of adaptation they would expect to see in a stocktake. And this initial data was used to inform our thinking about what needed to be included in the database and how we could structure the data. In 2024, we followed this by directly contacting the state and territory government departments and local government associations and others, primarily through the National Adaptation Working Group, to get them to input their data. So over the course of this project, we've come up against many of the challenges of adaptation stocktaking, and to briefly touch on some of the most frequently asked questions we get. We decided in this project to err on the side of inclusion and do not draw hard boundaries around how we define adaptation. This means that we can later extract data subsets and conduct a more comprehensive analysis. It is worth noting, though, that we did not include mitigation, as that was out of the scope of our work. One of the most challenging parts of this project is the language being used to describe adaptation, which varies greatly. So many of the projects we are looking at are not called adaptation, especially because the common terms and language differs so much among sectors and jurisdictions, has evolved over time, or has historically been a contentious and avoided topic. So this understanding had to be built into our methodology. We couldn't merely just conduct a Google search for adaptation and return the results we were looking for. Finally, our research was intended to be published online, so we knew we couldn't collect information that wasn't already existing in the public forum. This does influence the type of data that we're able to collect, but here we also see the value in encouraging transparent and open reporting. There's a lot of technical work that sits behind what you see on the website. Each suggested entry has to be investigated further by a member of our research team, and all of the relevant information collected together into a spreadsheet. We then go through the process of cleaning and refining the data and transferring it into an SQL database, which can be visualized on the website. Even though we now have a pretty well-refined approach, each entry takes about 30 minutes to understand and categorize, not to mention all the time that is required for us to build the database and maintain it. This approach does allow us, though, to pull together a consistent data set across a very broad array of sectors, scales, and jurisdictions. The structure of the database itself had to be iterated over time. For each entry in our database, we decided to collect a name, a linked URL, and descriptive details like location data, lead organization, and anything that we could find on funding and evaluation. On top of this is then the more categorical information, such as which hazard each was responding to, the National Climate Risk Assessment system that it fits within, and an IPCC categorization of adaptation used in the 6th assessment report. To put all of the adaptation activities together on the same playing field is a very careful game of interpretation, and one that requires a lot of knowledge from our team, our research team, and consistency in our thinking. To address this challenge, we had to develop a new category in our adaptation database, which we call adaptation purpose. Evidence of actual outcomes is extremely patchy and quite difficult to come by, so we have to work off these intentions instead. And John will talk a little bit about what this means for adaptation progress. But I just wanted to highlight all of the different types of activities that are put forward to us, and we could see that each of these were important steps in the adaptation process. So the NESP program has a focus on usable and accessible information, and we spent a lot of time understanding how our users would want to use and engage with information like this. We worked with the Adaptation Working Group to present an early test of what information was going to look like in the form of a Power BI dashboard, and then gain feedback on how people expected to use it. And so that brings me to our website, the Australian Adaptation Database website. That QR code will lead you to the website, and there should also be a link in the chat that's available to you, if not yet soon. And so when you land on the landing page of the website, you'll see that you have the option to search the data according to 6 different filters, including location, actor, hazard, and some of the other categories that we've developed. You can do that by clicking on a drop-down box and you'll see the various options. You can also click Browse All Data to see all of the results in the database. Once you're on the search page, you can see that each of the entries is displayed in a table, and it gives you a summary of the data that's being categorized against that. You can expand that for more information. There is a dashboard at the top that provides a summary of all of the data in your search results, and you can click on those and drill down to find more information. You can also hover over for more detailed information. The graph does show percentages, and this is very intentional because we found that adaptation is rarely just doing one thing at a time, and often each adaptation project was, for example, responding to various climate risks at the same time. So each entry had to be coded against up to 4 different climate risks, and that means that the total count that you're seeing in these graphs here might not necessarily add up to the total number of results in the table. But if you do hover over, you can see the count as well as the percentage. It gives you a better idea of what you're looking at. If you scroll down the page, at the bottom of the page, you can filter how many results you're seeing on each page and go through the pages to see the entire data set. You can also click each of these entries to get a pop-up window, which will show you more information about how the entry is being categorized. And there is a link to an external website for the projects that will give you more information about the project that we haven't been able to contain in our data set. So there's quite a lot of different search filters and a lot of different ways that you can view this data, but have a play around with it and see what you think. If you do find that you're not returning as many results as you expected, try and remove some of the results because there can be quite a lot of refining to be done. On the About page, you'll see all of the information about our project and links to some of our NESP Hub resources that are found on the NESP website. And on the metadata page, you'll find all of the information about how the methodology that we've used for building this database and some of the publications that we've published to go alongside that. All of our methodology is shared here in the hope that we can help others who are conducting adaptation stocktakes and stop reinventing the wheel, but also so that the data is produced in a way that it can be repeated in the future and measured against as a baseline data set. Finally, you'll also see that there is a Submit an Entry button on the page. You can use that to suggest individual entries that you think should be represented in the database, and we will go through and review each of those for inclusion. So what is shown in the database at this point in time is over 700 examples of adaptation that we can start to have an interesting discussion based on. It's not an exhaustive record of everything that has ever happened, but in the few months that it's been live, we've already seen this data as a valuable resource to help inform our understanding of climate change adaptation, to help governments with reporting, planning and investment, and to help kick off thinking on monitoring and evaluation. For the most part, what we've collected so far is a stocktake of what government is doing in adaptation, and this is partly reflective of our methodology today, working with government stakeholders, but it is a really interesting place to start looking. More data is regularly being added, and we are very much seeking to expand our data collection in the future to address gaps, particularly in the private sector and at local scales. This will include directly targeting adaptation at a local scale in 2026. Thank you. I'll now pass on to John and Heidi.
Thanks, Tia. Yeah, it's really impressive to see the thought and the process and the design that went into the database. So there's a few questions coming through, but please keep them coming. But for now, yeah, we're going to move on to our next speaker and get to the questions at the end. So I'd like to welcome Professor John Barnett. John is a professor in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Melbourne University. So he's a political geographer whose research investigates social impacts and responses to environmental change. With over 25 years of experience conducting field-based research on social vulnerability and adaptation to climate change in Australia, China, Timor-Leste and Pacific Island countries. John's research is now strongly focused on enabling responses to environmental change that promote social justice and peace. So it's over to you, John.
Thanks, Heidi, and thanks, Tia. I just would like to take this opportunity to thank Tia for all her work. The database has come to fruition because of her very hard work and persistence, so thanks, Tia. Thought I would just talk you through some of the logic behind the database. Next slide, Tia, thanks. Partly because there isn't much agreement on how to do databases, and the literature on this is not very clear. And so there's lots of questions about what do we include and by what basis. So it's pretty clear that when you do stock takes like this, there are trade-offs between the quality and the diversity and the breadth of data, and also problems about the commensurability or the comparability of data for different purposes. And that means these things are always the product of decisions about those trade-offs, and I'll explain some of the ways we've done that. There are in the literature some principles about how stock takes should be done to make them consistent, comparable, comprehensive and coherent, and we've very much been informed by those principles as we've developed this. So informed by the research and the little agreement that there is, we've developed this database for the purposes of characterising, reporting and monitoring progress towards adaptation within a sector or jurisdiction, including at the jurisdiction of the country. One of the principles that is very important is about transparency and the approach and the method, so others can improve on it, but also so people can be very clear about the findings that we draw and interrogate those findings in terms of the method that we have stated. And so those metadata pages are very, very important. If you have a concern or a question, you should be able to find some of the answers there on the database. So we're trying to be very transparent about that. And that's also one of the reasons why we're doing these talks about the database. So the aims of the database are here as a searchable repository of activities that can inform actors and provide new ideas on adaptation options. Adaptation is a bit of a difficult sell. People don't quite know what it means, I think, and that's part of its problem, as opposed to, say, mitigation or flood protection. And so this is a population of stuff that helps us think about what adaptation is and can help share those ideas. It supports reporting, as Tia said. It can help us begin to identify gaps in actions across sectors and jurisdictions. So where is it happening and who seems to be on top of things and where is it maybe lagging? Though that's a quality of the data and the reporting itself. It can help track trends, can help us think about what enables adaptation. So where we see a lot of progress, we may be able to begin to see bodies of work that are sequentially leading to further action. And so we think there's a lot of further work here around enablers, which we've also been doing alongside this anyway. It gives us a sample of things to think about, and is particularly useful perhaps for monitoring and evaluation purposes. It begins to build a population of adaptation activities or some sense of that population. It can help improve climate risk assessment by enabling factoring in the adaptation actions that would help offset climate risk, and others have told us that that's a particularly useful aspect of this database, that when we think about climate risk in a place, we can also then start to look at what has been done to manage that risk, which sort of is an attempt to sort of ameliorate risk. Can help lower insurance premiums and maintain credit ratings. Perhaps we could talk about that later, and useful for M&A. So we've had to develop an approach to assess progress in adaptation within and between jurisdictions. We've coded the data to enable us to report this, and I'm going to explain this in a second. I guess 2 caveats. First, there are always trade-offs. So every stock take like this is imperfect in some way, but we hope it's logically coherent and transparent. Secondly, we're not going too hard on the presentation of results yet. We don't have a whole lot of confidence yet in our data. There are some things we can say, but there are a lot of things we can't say. And I think it's there are obvious political implications of drawing conclusions prematurely about on the basis of the data, and we're not rushing to do that. So one of the major challenges with adaptation is the way in which adaptation itself is conceptualized and how we include it. It's actually a very hard thing to do, and it's complicated by several factors. Do we include things based on their effectiveness, either in terms of their impact or their process? That's an important question. Basically, you can't, and we haven't done that. We've decided we couldn't include things on the basis of effectiveness because there's no good evaluations to do so, and the problem of monitoring and evaluating adaptation is a whole other thing, which we're also working towards. And we didn't want to make judgments, and this is an important point of difference, I think, about this database versus some of the others that are around internationally. We don't presume to make judgments about the effectiveness of the activities that we see, because we don't have enough data to do so, because that's very difficult, because more frankly, that would be hubris, it would be rude. And it would also discourage people from reporting on adaptation if they then put their examples in and we form summary judgments about the merits of them. But we have noted where there are evaluations associated with some of the entries, and one of our longer term programs of work is around evaluation. On other issues, we've left it for stakeholders to decide what should and should not be included. Most of the actions in the database so far were recommended to us by practitioners, so we assume that the experts who recommended them know that they have some adaptation function and that in some way they're worth reporting on, and that is actually one of the ways you can do this, at least as recognised in the academic literature. And so when we haven't just taken that at face value, when we have investigated the examples that have been given to us, we rarely found a clear reason to say, yeah, that isn't in some way reducing vulnerability, that isn't an adaptation. In a few instances, we excluded some, partly because they were duplicates or because their relevance was so marginal we couldn't really see the contribution to reducing vulnerability. In a couple of examples, they were so mitigation focused we couldn't see the adaptation relevance. So we are screening, but we're not making too many judgments about them. We think this has worked. We call these things adaptation actions. We also think it makes more sense to be more inclusive in the initial point, and then for the subsequent analysis, we might then start making rules about exclusion. We might be stricter when we start analysing and ruling things in and out, but better to have a broad database from which we can then make analysis rather than to start making arbitrary rules about inclusion early on. So it's probably the case that this is still a small percentage of the things that might be included. The more we do research on adaptation, and here we're doing all sorts of field-based research all around the place, the more we see lots of things that are falling under the radar that have been done by artistic groups and community groups and Indigenous groups in all sorts of ways that you know would suggest that the population of adaptation actions is very large, and we're not quite sure what the sample is yet. Moving on to then how we're talking about progress. So insofar as this is useful for monitoring, we think we can say something about progress, and here's why. We can't make claims about outcomes, as I've said, so we have to base our assessment of progress on the idea of adaptation as a process. And so philosophical thinking, you know, we talk about outcomes as being either based on the outcome or about the value of a thing as being based on the value of its outcome or the value of its intentions. In climate change adaptation, because we have a lot of difficulty in even knowing how to assess outcomes, and we don't do that very well, the only way we could think about progress in adaptation is by evaluating the process itself. So we have to focus on process, and the way we've gone about process is to use. There are many of these adaptation process diagrams. There's a good one from Mark Stafford Smith, and they all share a general understanding that there is a logical series of steps that you go through in order to affect adaptation. They go from scoping through to visioning to prioritising, and they usually end up with some implementation of change and then M&A around that change. So that is a sort of idea about process, an idealised notion of process that has informed how we have gone about thinking about progress. These proposals all say that this is most likely to get the best outcome, the best chance of avoiding maladaptation. And so we have assessed this population of adaptation activities in the database, or we can assess the population of activities in the database against this ideal of process. Just stressing again, progress does not mean impact. And I don't think, in my lifetime or anybody else in this database's lifetime, we would have an adaptation database that was so great that it could be used for saying, we know how effective adaptation is across the country. We're a long way from that. So in practice, this is the only way we can do it. Progress is how well we are moving through the adaptation process. So we have a definition to you. Progress is the extent to which the sum of activities in any given sector or jurisdiction move the adaptation process towards interventions that affect changes, environments, or practices that are intended to reduce vulnerability to climate change. Lawyers amongst you will enjoy this definition. We don't think it works on the level of an individual entry, but we do think we could apply this idea about progress across a jurisdiction or across a sector. We may be able to say that for any given sector or jurisdiction, the distribution of activities across the process indicates the degree to which adaptation is moving towards intervention, i.e. whether we're making progress. The closer the collection action activities are to an intervention, the more progress could be said to be made. That doesn't mean we think there's some rigid order of steps. We think you can make progress by skipping some steps or some stages along the way. So we've conceptualized this as this kind of pyramid or diagram where we're saying the more activities within a sector or jurisdiction move from governance through to information gathering and research, through to knowledge building and engagement, through to institutional change and coordination, through the implementation, that is the affecting a change, the building of a thing or the pricing of a thing or whatever, or the change in behaviour, the more it moves towards that pyramid, or the population of activities in a sector or just jurisdiction moves up that pyramid, the more progress is being made. So you could imagine at some point we could actually take a number of adaptation activities that sit within a sector or jurisdiction and classify them into these different domains, put spots on the triangle, and get some sort of sense of the distribution of activities and how they're moving towards progress, and we may be able to compare that across sectors and jurisdictions over time. It's consistent. It's consistent with a theoretical idea about a good adaptation process. It's the only way we think that we can do this, actually. Okay, next slide. One of the other interesting things about this is that if we began with a categorization of a bunch of things as being either institutionalization or implementation, we would miss a lot. And so we've tried to break down this idea of institutionalization, which is, or you know, a similar problem with governance to some degree. It's a catch-all. We've tried to classify things that enable us to think a little bit more clearly about what the institutionalization of adaptation might be. And this is important because actually we see a lot of institutionalization in the database, but it takes different forms, and it's helpful to understand the different nature of those forms. So there's a lot of governance instruments, but there's also a lot of information gathering, there's a lot of knowledge building, there's a lot of stakeholder engagement, there's a lot of coordination, there's a lot of changes of institutions. And so the database is quite helpful in just starting to sort of tease these things apart and put those into a hierarchy of progress. And we think that there's a lot of thinking to be done there, and we think that it is possible to see in the data, and it's you know, it's a point of analysis, the initiation of an activity, be that a piece of research, or be that the formation of governance instrument, or be that the beginning of a network, and the subsequent actions that flow from that might move into other forms of institutionalization that might ultimately accumulate into an intervention. Has it been used? So the database has only been out for a couple of months, and we're finding, and at the recent adaptation conference in Perth, climate change conference in Perth, we had really good discussions, and we scrambled to write down all the different ways that people thought that this would be useful and they might use that. We're already seeing it being used in some ways. One of these was the Australian Local Government Association report recently, which looked at a number of examples of adaptation, and many of those were chosen from the adaptation database. So it was already helpful for this analysis. And you can see it quite clearly used in this, and it was a good report with some clear recommendations. The database is also used to inform the ANCRA. It's been used for some training in South Australia. It's informing some thinking and a network that TIRA is developing around monitoring and evaluation. It's been used for advocacy and research by VCOS. You know, and we're certain that state and Commonwealth governments, when they have to report on their adaptation activities, could get a lot of value out of the database. I'll stop there and hand over now to Alyssa.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that was really interesting to see the different ways that it can be used and is being used, and also the potential as well. Yes, so I'd like to welcome our last speaker, Alyssa Waters. Alyssa is a political geographer and lecturer in human geography. Her research focuses on the social and political dimensions of climate change adaptation and disaster governance in Australia and the Pacific. Alyssa has worked with state and the federal governments to provide research and advice on climate change adaptation, particularly with respect to sea level rise and coastal management. So handing over to you, Alyssa.
Okay, great. Thanks, Heidi. Okay, so as John's explained, the progress category that we're working with here is based on, I guess, our working definition of progress, and we think that it's a useful first step in tracking advances in adaptation at different scales. So as we've heard, the data set captures activity across the full spectrum of this kind of pyramid. So from high level planning through to on-ground delivery. So today I just wanted to, in the last part of this talk, I guess give you a little bit of a sense of where we're going with the analysis on this section of the database. And I won't kind of go across all of those aspects of the pyramid, but I thought that it would be useful to focus on the two ends of that spectrum. So governance instruments, so those foundational activities like strategies, plans, and frameworks that set direction and create the kind of enabling conditions for adaptation progress to go forward. And then at the other end of that, interventions. So tangible actions like projects, funding, and delivery programs. So looking at both ends of that spectrum across the three main levels of government, I think gives us new insights into where different types of adaptation is happening and how it's approached, and also where support could be strengthened at those different kind of scales. So these are really early analysis findings, but they start to show us how adaptation is being taken up across jurisdictions, not just in policy, but in practice as well. Okay, so I'll show these graphs for each level of government just to see how the broad trends are kind of being shown at this level across project purpose, national climate risk assessment systems that these activities are sitting within, and the kind of primary climate hazard. But this is just really to show you the kind of broad trends. You can have a look on the website yourselves, and I've also included here the total numbers that are shown for each of these levels of government. That's also just kind of for context, so you can see comparatively how many entries we have for each of these levels. And, you know, we can talk a little bit more about the differences in those as we go along. Okay, so starting with this kind of governance instruments, at a federal level, we see examples that serve to guide direction and set national priorities. So they're grouped here as national strategies, sectoral planning, environmental frameworks, but we've also got place-based efforts, and they're really kind of governance mechanisms that are centered around high-risk regions. So places like Lake Eyre and Torres Strait are coming through here. What's visible here is a growing recognition of adaptation kind of coming through as a governance priority across portfolios. So we're seeing this in integration into things like infrastructure policy, and also into kind of large and long-standing national strategies, like the Strategy for Nature. Sector-specific integration is emerging too. So at a federal level, we're seeing a kind of overt focus on adaptation in things like health and energy policies. Although at this level, adaptation is often just one of several priorities that are being dealt with in sector-based planning. Across the board, though, these instruments reflect a really important agenda setting and framing role for federal government in adaptation. And there may be opportunities to explore how they connect with implementation and with activities at other levels of government. And I'm sure that this is something that we're going to see kind of coming through in the forthcoming National Adaptation Plan. So in terms of interventions, we also found a range of federally supported interventions, and this is often through targeted programs or joint funding arrangements. Disaster management and recovery is a really big driver here. These also include, as I said, place-based investments. but as well, things like public health and monitoring, so kind of institutional programs like the aerator initiatives, the Australian smoke dispersion system, and environmental initiatives. So these are kind of interventions in line with the responsibilities of federal government in environmental protection, things like the Urban Rivers program. So while federal delivery is not the norm, that's federated governance system, the kind of delivery and intervention aspects of adaptation don't usually sit within kind of federal responsibilities. I think what we can see here, though, is that these examples show where national leadership is already supporting local or sectoral adaptation. And that often happens in partnership with other kind of jurisdictions and other organisations and institutions. So I think what these examples in the intervention category for federal government shows is that there are real opportunities for building on the existing models that are already in place that kind of facilitate that coordination right down to the level in which intervention is possible. And I think that's especially important where kind of cross-portfolio outcomes are involved in those adaptation initiatives. So moving to state and territory government adaptation. So this is by far the highest number of examples in the database. Partly that reflects our kind of engagement with states and territory adaptation departments and climate change agencies. But also it reflects the extent to which they have the capacity and the incentive to make these publicly available. So part of the inclusion criteria for the database is that we need to have publicly available information on this, and state governments and territory governments, have a lot of capacity in terms of putting that out there. So that's partly an aspect of the data collection here. But I think it's clear, though, that states and territories are playing a really central role, particularly in adaptation governance. So this table shows the kind of range of instruments that are captured in this kind of governance instruments aspect. And there's a lot in here, legislated strategies all the way down to kind of sectoral plans, but there's also regional coordination frameworks. So there's a lot of planning going on at the state level. Some jurisdictions are doing this planning within established mandates. So Victoria's Climate Change Act, for example, is a good example of that. In other jurisdictions, they're focusing on planning through and with regional partnerships or sector-specific integration of adaptation kind of aims. So I think what we can see here is that there's kind of clear momentum at the state and territory level. All of the state and territory governments have a range of plans, and there are really different models that are emerging for how to kind of undertake those strategies. I think that diversity can be a strength, and I think it also highlights the value of kind of sharing the learnings across these jurisdictions as that momentum speeds up. And there's a coordination kind of imperative there, especially for regions working on climate risk across borders. So in terms of state territory kind of intervention activities, state governments are also delivering or funding a wide range of interventions. So there's, a really kind of interesting range here, everything from kind of urban greening and nature-based solutions to structural initiatives, things like housing programs or implementing adaptation through housing programs, transport, design and planning, and coastal adaptation has for quite a long time now been one of the really big themes in terms of state-based interventions. So these often involve collaboration with local governments or particular at-risk communities, and they show how states can act as both enablers and implementers of adaptation. We're also seeing experimentation in these state-based interventions, things such as futures modelling or co-benefit assessments that are being integrated into these implementation activities. And I think these offer real insights into how we might kind of encourage that experimentation and some insights into scaling and replication where that might be possible. So finally, looking at local government adaptation, you can see from the total number here, this is in no way comprehensive representation of everything that local governments are doing here. And we're really working now on extending this section of the database to try and capture a much better range of what's going on at local government scales. That said, the database really is showing us what we've known for a long time, which is that local governments are engaging deeply with adaptation governance, with the planning and the kind of institutional setup for building momentum within their own kind of local governance jurisdictions. That's often happening through kind of existing planning instruments, but also through specific risk and vulnerability assessments and for local climate strategies that are being rolled out. Many of these tools and these governance instruments are being developed in-house, so using local knowledge and community engagement. So when it comes to that purpose category that we have here, we're not just labeling for one purpose. We can mark for or categorize based on multiple purposes. And what we're seeing here is those governance instruments, but also coupled with community engagement and knowledge brokering activities within the one activity. So we can start to see how local governments are actually enacting these governance instruments. I think what's striking here is the breadth of engagement in governance for adaptation across local government. Often that's happening in the absence of kind of formal mandates. And this speaks, I think, to the leadership already being exercised at a local level and to the potential value of further support, resourcing, and peer learning opportunities. And we're certainly hoping that all of these examples can help provide some incentive for those. In terms of interventions, we also see councils delivering a wide range of on-ground projects. So this one was definitely the hardest to fit on the slide. There's all sorts of things going on here: urban heat mitigation, green infrastructure, participatory climate labs, also really kind of practical aspects like wetland restoration and much more. So these actions are often small scale, but they've got the real kind of potential for high impact as they're tailored to place and closely connected to local priorities. I think the immediate opportunity here is to recognise, share and sustain these examples of adaptation through frameworks that may be able to kind of support continuity, funding and evaluation. So just to close on this, that's a lot of words on a screen, and I just wanted to show you the kind of range of examples that we're seeing here. But I also just wanted to kind of point that this point to what this early analysis kind of suggests about adaptation governance and progress in Australia. So the first kind of point is that progress really is occurring across a spectrum. So we're seeing a lot of progress in enabling conditions, but we are also seeing activity in on-ground delivery. And by looking at both governance instruments and interventions, we can see how we can see not just the intentions, but how adaptation is unfolding in real terms, and where support may be needed to bridge that gap between strategy and action. We're also seeing that roles are being defined through action, not just through formal responsibilities. It's clear that adaptation is being driven by all levels of government. In some cases with clear mandates, in others this is occurring through kind of initiative, assumed responsibilities, collaborations, and things like that. So I think tracking this helps us to understand where leadership is emerging and where coordination may be needed. And yeah, the kind of other points is that local and regional innovation is strong. And I think that that could be further enabled. So we see councils and regional agencies trialling new approaches and responding directly to community needs. And there's a real opportunity here to learn from this and to ensure that those lessons are shared and scaled. And that's really kind of the last point, and I guess ties into our hope for how this database is used, in that we can take advantage of that opportunity for coordination. So we know that many governance instruments call for integration and alignment, but the pathway to delivery on that kind of aim isn't always clear. So strengthening the kind of connection between planning, funding, and implementation could be a really key enabler for moving that momentum, pushing progress, and we certainly hope that having a view to what adaptation is occurring across what scales, and by systematically mapping who's doing what, we can kind of get a better understanding of that evolving landscape of adaptation in Australia and where those opportunities lie. So on that note, the last thing that we would really love from anyone who's watching this is to help us build out the kind of comprehensiveness of this database. So if you have examples of projects, programs, activities, individual ones, we have a submit an entry QR code here. And if your organisation has more than a few examples, then we can certainly help to get those into a spreadsheet and get them into the database. So please contact our team. We'd be really happy to hear from you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alyssa. Yeah, it was really interesting to see that breakdown of like federal, state and local. And I definitely agree that there's some really great innovative stuff happening at that local level. Okay, so we're quickly running out of time, so let's get to the Q&A section of the webinar. Again, encouraging you to use that speech bubble on the right-hand side. That's your chat function to ask your questions. I will get started with some that are already in there. This one's nice and straightforward, so I'll ask them to the panel, and the three of you can decide who is best to answer. So is it possible to download selections from the database?
I guess I can answer that one. It's not possible at the moment. That's something that we probably will add later on. But given that the data set is still being built out at the moment, we haven't included that as a feature yet. And we're also working to put out some more analysis on the data itself. So it probably will be a possibility, but not yet.
Great, thanks, Tia. So is there consideration of adding a spatial layer that shows the data sets in relations to regions?
They are geocoded already. Tia can talk more about that.
So at the moment, the data for states and local government areas are coded to the ABS areas, and also to SA2s, which is town and region, although there's not many that are only happening at that scale. They're usually higher than that. The difficult one is regional activities, because region isn't a defined ABS area. So we have to work within the state and local government boundaries. And that's something that we want to do more of in the future. And hopefully once the National Adaptation Plan and the National Climate Risk Assessment are released, it'll give us some good information to work with on that analysis as well. Just to add on the downloading data, although we can't download it from the website at the moment, that's something that we do collaborate with the different stakeholders that we've been working with to give back the data that you've been providing to us.
Yeah, fantastic. And when you say ABS, you mean Australian Bureau of Statistics, right? Tia, yeah, they're divisions. Okay, awesome. Okay, here's a interesting one. As you review and code each entry, could it be used for a gap analysis to prioritize actions / funding where an area or hazard is not covered by a program or research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is part of the point of the database. I don't think that occurs at the level of, unless I'm misunderstanding the question, at the level of coding an individual thing, but it is the population of things across the sector or jurisdiction where that becomes apparent. And I guess the difficulty with that is that the database is as good as the information we receive. And so some sectors or jurisdictions and in some sectors are less likely to report. That doesn't mean there's a gap in action. It just means there's an absence in reporting. So the value of that becomes better the more mature the database becomes, and the more we sort of start to see, you know, what we feel like might be some saturation of entries around different sectors and jurisdictions and sectors. But we can certainly see when you start looking at the hazard issues and the sector response issues that there are more responses in some sectors than others. We can start to see which kind of political jurisdictions are responding to those things more than others. We can start to see sequences of actions from state down to local government over time in those sectors and jurisdictions. But there's a lot in there around analysis of those gaps and opportunities.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. So another question. This looks like a hugely valuable database. Has thought been given to how this can be made an ongoing operational service lasting beyond the current National Environmental Science Program hub?
We've certainly thought about it. And we certainly think, I think the difficulty with things like this is that they're not continued. One of the great successes, it seems to me, of things like the Bureau, is the longitudinal funding that enables the collection of data over time. And we do that pretty well around climate science and meteorological science. We don't do that very well around adaptation. It would be great if this could be institutionalized in that way because we think it is useful. It would be great if it could be institutionalized in some way because we've done a lot of work. We think we've done this pretty well. By international standards, we think we've done this very well. So yeah, it'd be great to keep it going in some way. I'm happy to identify different ways that might be going if somebody wants to ask.
Tia, did you have anything to add? Okay, great. Okay, so another question. I wonder if as you branch out to the private sector, there'll be more need to extend into mitigation activities. I think many companies would see mitigation as an adaptation to transition risk and would see this as more of a priority than adaptation to physical risk.
That's a good point, and it makes a lot of sense. I guess I'd be pretty reluctant to do that. It feels like a database of mitigation activities is a whole other thing. It would be good if somebody were to do that, it seems to me. I don't actually know about what the reporting around mitigation activities is. I'm only just starting to think about that now as that question has been asked. So no, but I think it would be useful because there are things in the database that are both mitigation related that have adaptation code benefits, particularly around things like heating and cooling and stuff like that. So actually the points of overlap would also be extremely useful. Also because thinking about this in terms of enablers, things that come through the mitigation side are clearly enabled by market opportunities and energy savings and you know, there are some pretty strong economic motives for those things. And if those economic things drive adaptation code benefits, it's really useful to understand those things. That seems to be a really important enabler. The mitigation is relevant, but you know, do we want to add that into the database? Probably not. We're struggling with adaptation as it is.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. So another question, do you anticipate significant changes to the database when the report of the NCRA, National Climate Risk Assessment, is released?
I can take that one. So I've been working with the National Climate Risk Assessment and the lead author for the adaptation section of that report. And we developed the category, or we added the category at the beginning of this database process, so for the NCRA system, so that we could kind of develop the database along with the climate risk assessment. We also use the data in this to input into that process. So I don't see I don't anticipate changes to the database, but both of these processes are running in line with one another so that they can inform one another.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great answer, Alyssa. And yes, another question. Seems like there's probably a lot of value in the thick data around each project, the information that cannot be easily captured in a database because it is, for example, qualitative, nuanced, or context specific. Have you thought about how the database might help to make that information or knowledge more accessible to future adaptation decision-making processes? And then in brackets, e.g. by acting as a phone book for people with relevant experience. I'm glad you've got that all in front of you.
Yeah. I mean, yes. So you're talking to people who are at their heart qualitative social scientists. So yeah, I mean, this feels like a sideline to what we normally do, which is go and find things out by talking to people and doing field work. So there's a few answers to that. I guess in the first instance, by making these links to websites, people who want to themselves know more about those things, and that's kind of part of the value. So if you're wanting to implement an adaptation project and you find something in the database that is useful, you can contact them yourself and find out yourself. So it is a bit of a kind of a dating platform already in that sense. We are hoping to do two things in the future, which are more qualitative. One is to continue some of the work we've been doing on enablers. And if you look on the website, for the NESP website for this project, you'll see a couple of case studies about the enablers of adaptation, which start to get at kind of cause and effect and what were the sort of institutional circumstances and moments and opportunities and factors that enabled an adaptation implementation activity. And we think this is really helpful, right? So we can stop moving to talking about all the things that might stop adaptation and barriers and all the things that cause vulnerability to starting to analyze what enables good adaptation practice. And we think those lessons are very helpful. And the database, I think, can help us do that by selecting cases, but also, as we say, we can start to see sequencing of things through the database that, that a policy has led to action. Those actions, or in a policy, has led to a plan. Those plans have led to research. The research has led to stakeholder engagement. That stakeholder engagement has led to an implementation. So we can see cause and effect, and following through that and describing that cause and effect is something we would really like to do much more of. We think that's very valuable. We also want to use this as a platform for starting to think about better evaluation of adaptation projects, which is another form of, I guess, thick description. So not just the thing happened, but what were the consequences of that. And so that is about enablers and best practice, which we have been doing, but we would like to do more of, and the database gives us a kind of spine for doing that work and thinking about sampling that across sectors and jurisdictions with the evidence that we already have. Finally, and I've probably missed a few things here, Tia might want to talk a bit about some of the community of practice work that we're developing.
I'm very sorry, we're going to run out of time, Tia, so we can perhaps do some follow-up when we send out the webinar link to everyone, but I will wrap things up to keep us on track. Thanks to our speakers for really great, insightful presentations, and to all of the audience for your active participation and for supporting the Climate Systems Hub. We hope you've taken something away. That QR code there will take you to a spot where you can sign up for our e-newsletter, and that will have information about upcoming webinars. Before we finish, we love your feedback. I think my colleagues in the back are going to pop a little survey link in there. If you could complete that, we'd really appreciate that. Thanks everyone who has been active behind the scenes. And I better call it an end there. We'll see you next time, everyone.